Okay. So you should be able to see a live option. If you just go to home. Yes, there we go. Yes, Lent online. Right. You click.
This is this house video or
Yes, that's fine. Click on that. It doesn't really have anyone to get into it. I'll kind of block it out. Or I might just put a poster that says no video. Right now, if I'm going to talk, you should go here. William, can you hear me?
William, can you hear me? Yes.
That's right. I will put a.
With a delay of a few seconds.
That's fine because they won't know any better. I'll go and put a microphone on, and then we'll see what level we want this speaker on.
I think it will on maximum.
Test 2 3. Test 2 3.
Is it on?
Test 2 3. This is a test for the live stream.
Well, it's coming out. I don't know how loud you expect.
You can hear it.
Oh yeah, I can hear it. I can hear it, but I mean, this is. I turn these right up now.
Okay, well, I'll put the speaker up a little bit more, and then we'll have a go at that. Perfect. Thank you very much. see if I can find a way of propping up a piece of card. Come up backwards.
No, it's fine.
It says this is an audio only stream.
Yeah.
No.
But is there, you change the volume on that? Is there going to be any sound coming out? Because when I set it was on maximum.
Ah, so is it this black dot?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. When I was spinning it around, what I saw was this hole. And so to begin with, I assumed it was this hole, but it's actually this black dot, isn't it?
Yes, the dot, yes.
Max, perfect. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to St. Mary Abbots and to this, our Lenten event on C.S. Lewis at the request of none other than Otto Barrow, sitting front and centre. So you can thank him at the end of the evening for this idea. Lovely to see so many of you here, and we are starting a new adventure today in the life of St. Mary Abbots. We are live streaming the audio of this event, and I've just gone and checked my phone, and we have no less than one person currently listening in from distance. The audio... Oh, that's you. Way to let me down. The audio is also going to be available after the event up on our normal YouTube page, so those of you who want to listen again to capture all those nuggets of interest, or those of you who want to direct your friends in the right direction, we'll stick it up on our Twitter, on our Facebook, on our social media, and you'll be able to find where you can listen to that. The main event of the evening, of course, though, comes from Tom Price, who I'm very glad can be with us this evening. I got in touch with him via St. Mellitus College, which is our local theological resource just down the Earl's Court Road. It's a teaching centre for ordinands and those in the service of the church, and indeed those who are just interested in theology. There's a number of people from our own congregation who go there on a weekly basis, and they also put on occasional events as well. So if you're interested in more events like this, then they're a nearby place to look into. That's not where Tom is from, though. Tom is a senior tutor at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics and an apologist for the Zacharias Trust. You can find out a bit more about their work by Googling Zacharias Trust, and you'll see that on the 18th of May they're doing a study day in London. It's on today's biggest ethical questions, AI and medical research and all that sort of thing. Tom's particular interest is in the intersection of art, philosophy, and theology, and that makes him the right person to be speaking tonight, because that's precisely the sort of thing that Lewis himself was interested. And Tom is going to be answering the question of why we're still bothering to talk about that man and his prophetic voice and relevance to the world today. Please, would you warmly welcome him?
Well, good evening. It's great to be with you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for braving the dark night and coming into this place to think about together somebody whose voice spoke to a nation in his moment of history. Not many people are caught up in that same moment as Lewis was, as Wilberforce was. And we might ask, what was it about him? What was it about that moment that meant that his voice was something that the BBC were broadcasting, something which publishers wanted to reproduce? What was it about his stories that so drove into our culture that we still read them to our kids now? What was Tolkien's influence in this story? We might look at that in a little bit. And who was C.S. Lewis? And I think if we're trying to answer this question, why is C.S. Lewis still being read today? We have to find out more about who he was as a person. Lewis was born into a bookish family of Protestants in Belfast in Ireland, November 29th, 1898. His father, Albert, and his mother, Florence, were avid readers. They possessed first-rate minds. They were bright, and they encouraged their children to read. They were members of the Church of Ireland. They were eclectic in their reading tastes. They purchased and read hundreds of books, and none of those books, unlike my Netflix account for my 8-year-old and 6-year-old, none of those books were off limits. In fact, their love for the printed word was probably what passed on to Lewis first of all in some ways. Jack Lewis, as C.S. Lewis was known by those close to him, there's some debate about why he was called Jack. Some people think it's a story to do with a dog. Alistair McGrath's more skeptical of that view. He was known as Jack, and his older brother Warren, his only sibling, 3 years older than him, were not only able to read aloud and taught to practice reading aloud, but they were encouraged to dive into, to explore the large family library. In his autobiography later on, Lewis recalled early memories of endless books. There were books in the study, books in the dining room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep on the great bookcase in the hall and the landing, books in a bedroom, books piled high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds, he remembered, and none were off limits. On rainy days, and there were many of these in Northern Ireland, he pulled volumes off the shelves and entered into worlds created by authors such as Conan Doyle, Nesbit, Twain, and Longfellow. When he was 10 years old, 1908, he is sent to school in Watford as his mother is dying of cancer. At school, Lewis abandons his childhood Christian faith and becomes an atheist, becoming interested in what he calls mythology and the occult. In 1914, when he was 16 years old, Lewis dropped out of school, and his father finally agreed that he could be privately tutored by William Kirkpatrick, his father's old tutor. This man was known as the Great Knock. This experience was absolutely formative for Lewis. He absolutely hated boarding school in Watford, and he felt like when he started to be tutored by the Great Knock, he felt like the ceiling opened, like he was suddenly re-engaged with learning and with education. Kirkpatrick instilled in him a love for Greek literature, mythology, and sharpened his skills in debate and in reasoning. In 1916, Lewis was then awarded a scholarship at University College, Oxford. In 1917, Lewis left his studies to volunteer in the British Army, and during World War I, he was commissioned as an officer in the 3rd Battalion, Somerset Light Infantry. Lewis arrived at the front line in the Somme Valley in France on the day of his 19th birthday, and he there experienced trench warfare. On the 15th of April, 1918, so the following spring, Lewis was wounded. Two of his colleagues, two of his friends were killed by an English shell that fell short of its target, and Lewis suffered from deep depression and from homesickness and shell shock during his convalescence. By December 1918, he had been discharged and was able to return to his studies at Oxford. He there received first class in honor moderations, Greek and Latin literature, and in 1920 he got a first in the greats, philosophy and ancient history, and in 1922 a first in English. At the age of 32, owing in part to the influence of Tolkien and other friends, Lewis moved away from his atheism, moved away from his skepticism, and moved towards Christian belief. Around the age of 32, Lewis became a Christian, slowly, moving stage by stage, bit by bit. In his journey to faith, Lewis did not take the claim of the Bible's origin as the starting point, the claim of the Bible being divine or the Bible being God-given or God's word. He didn't take that as his starting point and then try to set about substantiating that. Instead, his road was the other way around. The Bible stood on the shelf with all of the other books of history without any distinction among other authors like Homer, Herodotus, Plato, Cicero, Virgil. The Bible was merely the Hebrew section of antiquity, without any special claim of divine inspiration upon it. And Lewis did not come to Christian faith by trying to grasp hold of any unreachable, massive, unnatural claims, but by beginning with no claim at all and slowly becoming convinced of the existence of God, and then a few years later, becoming interested in Jesus and who he was. And only then did he begin to see the Bible as scripture. The divine inspiration for him of the Bible came much later, it came last, and it was not his starting point. Lewis himself wanted to follow where the argument led. He wanted to follow through with where the argument led, even if that meant personal challenge. In fact, in one of his early radio broadcasts, he anticipated a certain amount of pushback that he would get for describing man's condition in the world, a man's state. And he said his response was, "I'm not really too interested in assigning blame. I want to find out what's true. I want to find out what's true." And Lewis felt that there was a fundamental problem in the world. On one hand, he had a very active imagination. He loved stories. He created a biscuit tin garden or world with talking animals and creative, imaginative stories on the lid of a big biscuit tin called Boxen that his older brother Warren gave him to play with. On the other hand, he was a scholar at Oxford. He was able to reason and think through in very clear and clinical ways about the world, about philosophy, about history, about morality. And he found himself wanting to look at the broad scope of reality, not just to simply say, I'm going to look at science and see what that says, but he wanted to look at the values in stories like bravery, courage, brotherhood, goodness, evil, darkness. He wanted to look at all of it together and to think about the world in not just one dimension, but in many different ways at the same time. And as he slowly explored his faith in gradual stages with points of decision, he finally came to a point where these two separate worlds came together. On one hand, he said that the physical universe, understood through science, is deeply meaningful and deeply wonderful, but it has a certain tinniness to it. That was his phrase. It felt tinny. It didn't always hold and yield the values that so appealed to him in the stories and the mythologies that he loved. On the other hand, he wanted to be somebody who let logic in and let reason in and wanted to follow through well with his thinking mind. In other words, he wanted to hold together reason and imagination. And he wanted his view of the world to bring together both of these things. That was what he was hoping for. So Lewis slowly began to re-embrace Christianity, influenced in part by a very key conversation with Tolkien, which I'd love to tell you about. You see, Lewis would kneel down in his room at Magdalen, and he said this, "You must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen, night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted, even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him who I so earnestly desired not to meet." He's talking about God. "That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me, and in the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and I knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England." Lewis and Tolkien's conversation, as I've said, was key. One night, Lewis and Tolkien stayed up late, as they often did, much to the disapproval of Tolkien's wife, who worried that this hanging around with Lewis, and particularly going up to his house, the Kilns, up in Risinghurst, where I live actually opposite it, Tolkien's wife felt that, the way that the Warren and Jack poured their pipes out on the floor and just trod the ashes into the carpet, she didn't buy their thinking that it kept away the moths from the books. She thought it was a health hazard, and she forbade Tolkien from going anywhere near the house. But Tolkien and Lewis were staying up late one night talking. And Lewis turned to Tolkien and he said this. He said, "I don't understand." He'd come to this point where he saw that Jesus was a real person in history. He'd reasoned himself to the point of saying, "I think God exists. I think God's real." He hadn't yet had that kneeling down experience in Magdalen. On the top of a bus going up Headington Hill, he'd said to himself, I think you're there, and I'm going to open the door to you. That he'd had this sort of moment of of being aware of God. And here's what he says. "The odd thing was that before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears to be a moment of wholly free choice. I was going up Headington Hill on the top of a bus. Without words and without images, a fact about myself was somehow presented to me, and I became aware that I was holding something at bay. I felt myself being given a free choice. I could open the door or keep it shut. I chose to open it. And on this journey, and also in a journey down to visit London Zoo with his brother, he has these sort of moments of openness, of opening his heart, and as for sort of saying, yes, I think you're there, God. But he lamented with Tolkien one night, look, I've come to believe that I think this is true, but I just don't understand how events from 2,000 years ago can have any meaning for me today. That was his issue. How does this mean something to me now? I might believe it with my rational mind, but how does it connect to the things that really move me in life? Tolkien replied, you have no problem in delighting and being moved by untrue fairy stories and myths. You find these stories so meaningful. They make you cry. They make you sing. You love all these different mythologies and stories. The gospel, on the other hand, is the true fairy story. All of these other stories that move you have echoes of that grand story. Echoes of what has been lost. Echoes of what we're looking for. This is the true myth that happened in history. Just as those other myths touch you, can touch us, so the gospel can touch us and can answer. Lewis's response to this? No, you're wrong. Fairy stories are just lies breathed through silver. That was Lewis's response. Fairy stories are just lies breathed through silver. In other words, they're not really true. They may move us, but they're not really true. So Lewis is trying to reconcile these two worlds, the world of reason and the world of imagination. On one hand, he admits that the rational world has a certain tinniness to it. On the other hand, the imaginative world, is it really true? Is it really real? Tolkien went back, and over the next few days, he composed a poem called Mythopoeia. At the top of the poem, he wrote this: to one who said that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. Here's one of the stanzas in the poem he wrote. The heart of man is not compounded of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him, though now long estranged. Man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and he keeps the rags of lordship that once he owned. In other words, there is a memory of the truth. There's a memory, an echo of the old gospel story through the imagination of man, and that is what is moving Lewis and all these other stories. A bit like when Calvin wrote, human beings are like ruined statues in which we can still see the outline of their former glory. Tolkien's phrase, the rags of lordship. 2 weeks later, Lewis had his most profound conversion experience. I think, I'm extrapolating a little bit here, but I think he saw that the things that moved him, that he cared about, that he wanted to live for, bravery, courage, goodness, that these things actually echoed with the reality of the reasonable world. They echoed with that gospel picture. Tolkien's stories are themselves a study of this. Memories of an original golden age from which we've fallen, the subsequent longing for the glorious rescue of that age, and the rescue by Ilúvatar of the creatures of Middle-earth. I would love to come back and tell you about Tolkien some other time, perhaps. Lewis's general approach, then, once he had this newfound faith, took on this route that he'd taken himself. And it's very natural that when we discover something, we want to explain it to somebody else. It's very natural that we imagine that they are going to find, we talk with authority about the way we came to it or the way we discovered it. Lewis's communication was broad. He engaged in literature, he argued philosophically, he presented fictional writing, both in terms of medieval fiction and in terms of science fiction. He created poetry, extraordinary word pictures that have stayed with us, almost mythology in books like his first book. And then there was the telling of his own story. He didn't leave himself out of the door. But in all of this writing that he did, I see a common thread of him weaving together faith, reason, and imagination. Faith, reason, and imagination. Lewis felt that you could look at Christian faith and in the way he had done, and you could ask of it, is it historical? Does it make philosophical sense? Is it ethical? You could ask, in some ways, questions from the outside, but he also felt that you could try to get at it and look at it in another way by stepping inside of it and looking from the inside at how it showed the world and what it said about the world. He tells the story of wandering into his tool shed one day and seeing a broken bit of the roof, letting in a shaft of sunlight through the room. Now, because the tool shed was a little bit dusty, he could look and he could see the sunlight coming down through the room, through the space. He could step back and see very clearly there's something there. It's the sunlight. I can see it. On the other hand, then he said he stepped into the beam, into the sunbeam, and looked up through the gap. And for a few blinking moments, he saw the source of the sunlight. And as he saw it, he saw an illustration there of how we can sometimes put on the jacket of Christian faith and look at the world from stepping in and looking at the world from its point of view. And so he said this: I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And so Lewis would then begin to appeal to the people that he spoke to the people he was writing to his readership. He would begin to appeal to them through reasoning, through evidence, and through imagination. He develops perhaps the rational side of his case, the evidential side of his case, particularly in books like Mere Christianity, or The Abolition of Man, Miracles, or The Problem of Pain, which is in some ways him addressing the thinking problem of pain. Now, he didn't, in the same way as he hadn't, start by assuming that the Bible was true, that the Christian faith was true, and then presuppose everything from that. He was simply inviting people to put on the lens, to put on the jacket, and to see how things might look differently. And as he expounded and laid out a variety of different arguments, he also, alongside this, began to use arguments that appealed in all sorts of ways. And this is part of the genius of Lewis. He could do the traditional, classical, philosophical apologetics thing. He could do that very, very well. On the other hand, he came up with some very, very innovative arguments, like the desire argument. The desire argument is absolutely fascinating. I'm sure you'd like to find out more about it. Let me try to explain some of his classical arguments briefly, first of all, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about the desire argument. So the classical arguments often started with morality, or a sense of right and wrong. And so Lewis's moral argument, rightly understood, says, okay, in the world we have right and wrong. What system of seeing the world is the best explanation for the existence of those values in the world? And he posits different theories and works through whether or not they work or not. Then you have his historical arguments. And this is where you discover what's called the trilemma, his trilemma argument. Have you heard sometimes the phrase mad, bad, or God? That comes from Lewis, and that comes from his work on the historicity, or the historical question of who Jesus is. Where does that come from? Well, Lewis is thinking about the claims that Christ made. He's wrestling directly with Jesus' words about himself, the sorts of things that Jesus claimed about himself. Jesus claiming to have existed before Abraham, say in John chapter 3, claims to be the God who revealed himself to Moses. Jesus claims to be the God who is the creator of all things. He claims to be someone who's come from heaven, someone who will eventually judge the whole human race, a claim Jesus makes repeatedly through the Gospels. Lewis is a literary man. He could read, he could see that Jesus was making these sorts of outrageous claims about himself. And Lewis was willing to ask the question, what does this mean? What is the impact of this? What happens if we work this through? And so here he brought in his logical mind. Now, if you heard somebody making these sorts of claims, one of your friends perhaps one day rang you up and made similar claims to the ones I've just mentioned that Jesus made, you might be tempted to think that they had completely lost it, that they'd gone mad. You might think that they were insane. We even have a phrase for somebody who has these sorts of grandiose claims, a messianic complex that we maybe playfully apply to each other as we struggle with our different narcissisms. But we have this understanding. If anybody made such claims, you might say that they were crazy. But as you look through the New Testament, this is what Lewis found, as you look through the Gospels, the one thing you have to say about Jesus is that he's one of the most well-integrated, most well-balanced people you've ever encountered. Somebody who's at peace with themselves, at peace with most of his fellow men and women, somebody who inspired loyalty and devotion in the people around him. Now, some rejection, and others the accusation of blasphemy, but they never accused him of being crazy in that. So that's one possibility that Lewis explores. The second possibility that Lewis considers is that he's bad, mad, bad, or God. That he's wicked, for example. Now, if we came across somebody who claimed to have this authority that we've mentioned that Jesus claimed to have, and the power and the status that Jesus had, we might think they maybe were somebody that, was a bit wicked. They were somebody who, for personal reasons, wanted to claim they had all that status, all that authority, because they wanted to deceive people for personal gain, maybe for personal ambition, for wealth, for status. Maybe that's why Jesus made these claims, in order to profit from other people. And again, as you read through the data, Lewis found that this rings hollow too. Let's explore that just a little bit more. Now, Jesus is, as we've said, a well-integrated person. I don't think I've ever read anything by anyone that's managed to sustain anything else about Jesus. We might try to explain the claims away. Oh, he didn't really claim that. He didn't really mean that, even though they're there pretty clearly in a number of different ways. But we might try to say, well, Jesus, as Lewis has considered, is a mad person. Well, you don't really find people saying that in the Gospels. You don't really find people who engage with the Gospel saying that this person was crazy. So was Jesus doing it for personal gain, for personal ambition? There's some problems with this idea, as Lewis considered. Jesus didn't have many followers during his lifetime. He was constantly making it difficult for people to follow him with hard sayings, which made hundreds of people sometimes walk away from him and go back to what they were doing before. And you find him over and over again avoiding the crowds, telling people not to tell what he'd done. You actually find him informing people not to spread what he'd done, sometimes in healing them, for example. You find him over and over again doing this. He doesn't seem to be particularly concerned to have a lot of people following him, and a lot of people acclaiming him, and a lot of people talking about him. We actually read of him refusing the pressure of the crowds a number of times. In one example, to crown him as king after the feeding of the 5,000. The crowd are so overwhelmed by what he's done, they want to make him a king by some kind of force. So clearly, we don't have somebody here who is after political power. I don't think that's believable. So maybe his motive was wealth. Maybe that will work better for our thinking. Well, he doesn't seem to have any money or even a home. He said of himself, the birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to live, nowhere to lay his head. So as we look through the Gospels, not even Jesus' enemies could find any grounds to accuse him of any wrongdoing at all. The only accusation they could make stick was the one that he had claimed to be God. They couldn't make any other accusation stick to him. So that's where Lewis got to, and that was what Lewis was considering. So then maybe you get to this extraordinary conclusion. Jesus is a person of obvious integrity, out of which balance, love, and righteousness shine. A person who is not afraid of authority in any way whatsoever. A person of such moral strength that he never, ever surrendered to other people, to pressure from other people. So the thought that he might have been foolish doesn't make any more sense than the thought he might have been mad. So Lewis, in a very important passage in Mere Christianity, writes this: I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He'd either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Lewis bringing together a very challenging, very personally challenging landing point as he asks his reader to consider, who do you think he is? Maybe in the same way as Jesus would turn to his disciples, say in Mark chapter 8, and say, who do you say I am? But who do you say I am? So the desire argument. Lewis is, for me, one of Lewis's most interesting arguments. Lewis actually felt that the desire argument had the capacity to convert people more deeply than any other argument. But he felt there was a weakness to it because you could just simply say, well, I don't feel that desire. Let me give you the simple version, and I think you're probably clever enough to me to give you the more complicated version as well. So the simple version is this. There is a desire in us that nothing in this world can satisfy. It's a natural desire. It's not a non-natural desire. It's not something like wanting a Lamborghini or wanting to be Superman. It's a natural desire like sleep or thirst or hunger. And for every corresponding natural desire, Lewis argued, there's an object which meets those natural desires. There's this desire in us, a natural desire for something beyond what this world can satisfy us with. Even after we read the greatest literature, listen to our favorite music, possess those toys or tools or things that we think are going to satisfy us, we still sit back and say, is this all there was to this? Do I not long for something more? Even after experiencing great intimacy, we might say that. And so Lewis says, with every natural object, there's a corresponding answer. If we experience a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, if I can find inside myself a desire that this world cannot satisfy, then the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. So that's the heart of the desire argument. The slightly more fleshed out version is this. There are three desires in the human heart. The longing for peace, for purity, for wholeness, moral purity. The saint-like longing to be whole inside, not fragmented, not in different identities on Facebook and Instagram and in life and in work and in home and on the internet, but to have an integrated whole moral identity. That's one longing. The second longing is the longing for intimacy and love, the longing for closeness, for somebody to know you and not reject you, for somebody to know you deeply and to not reject you. Real intimacy. Somebody once said, slightly cheesy, but somebody once said, to understand intimacy, you just have to understand the phrase, into me you see. Our fear with intimacy quite often is actually if we really show each other what we're like, then we will not be able to accept each other afterwards. So we have this desire for intimacy, a desire to be whole and not fragmented. The third desire Lewis points to is the desire for home. What he means by this, have you ever had an experience where you've been doing something, you might have been involved in a project, you might have been involved maybe traveling in a different part of the world, you might have been involved in a journey, maybe it was a family holiday. You were with people that you loved, you were doing something you loved, and you just didn't want it to end. You felt safe, you felt like you had purpose. It was a sense of home with those people. Maybe it's people that you're no longer around anymore. But we have a glimpse sometimes of a place that's secure, a place that we want to just be in forever. I feel like that at the moment. My parents are both fairly well. They're in their 70s or just approaching their 70s. I've got three young children. I've got an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. My wife and I don't have any health scares on the horizon at the moment, even though that's the stage of life that we find ourselves at. I actually just want life to be okay like this now. I don't want to age. I don't want my parents to get any older. Does that resonate? Okay. This is the longing for home. Lewis says that the longing for inner peace and purity, the longing for intimacy and love, and the longing for home, this is actually the longing for God. This is the longing for God in heaven, in a place where we are secure, we are known, where we're not fading away, where we're accepted and known in total, and where we are being fixed and integrated and cleansed. The book of Psalms says, He will forgive you your iniquities and wash you, and you will be whiter than snow. Lewis felt that this reflection on desire, that if we look inside our longings, had the capacity to bring us to such an intimacy with God that it truly was to step inside the sunbeam and to see the world from a different vantage point. This was the heart of Lewis's sense of God. It wasn't beliefs out there. It was a living experience of intimacy, of wholeness, of relationship with the God that he'd come to know. I need to continue. I can get excited and talk a lot about some of these things. I need to continue so that we have some time for questions as well. Lewis also felt that reality itself was iconoclastic. What do I mean by that? Well, for something to be iconoclastic is that it breaks down. We may have an image of something, an image of reality that's formed by different influences on us, by the reported observations of other people, by books, by lectures, by conversations, by other interferences. And these may be sort of impressions we might have, and we might have it of God, perhaps. We might have an idea of what God is like. And they may be true impressions, they may be false impressions, but Lewis felt that reality had the capacity to pull apart our small ideas about God. Our ideas about God being in a box over there, just like Batman, let's say, who we call on when we have trouble. We put the bat sign out, and Batman comes out of the cave in his Batmobile, beats up all the bad guys, and then goes back in the Batcave. Lewis felt that reality deconstructed those deistic ideas of God, where we leave God at a distance. He felt that we had to see a deeper picture. Here's what he says. Images, I must suppose, have their use, or they would not have been so popular. It makes little difference whether they are pictures or statues outside the mind or imaginative constructions within it. To me, however, their danger is more obvious. Maybe images of the holy easily become holy images, sacrosanct. My idea of God is not a divine idea, though. It has to be shattered. My idea of God has to be shattered over time, again and again. He shatters it himself. He is the great iconoclast. Could we not almost say that this shattering is one of the marks of his presence? The incarnation is the supreme example, so Christ's coming. It leaves all previous ideas of the Messiah in ruins, and most are offended by this, and some are blessed by it. But these are not the same thing. So Lewis wants to say, when something's iconoclastic, it takes, you see, if you smash an icon, like a picture of God or something like that, then that's, you're breaking it apart, you're enlarging a picture of something. And Lewis felt that we had to get past these reduced ideas of God. And he thought this was very important and a very important doorway into seeing things. And that for him led into the idea that the center of Christianity was Christ. As I've said on the handout, Christianity is Christocentric. It's not hugely complicated, but it's important to Lewis. It's important to the way he wanted to speak and the way he wanted to engage. Lewis felt that at the center of Christianity was this possibility of Christ, this cross and the incarnation and the work of Christ in coming. He didn't feel that it was possible simply to stand at Christianity and to see it as a system of beliefs or a moral system. He felt that was to miss it. He felt that the heart of it was Christ, and to really wrestle with Christianity, one has to wrestle with Christ himself. Okay, So, okay, I need to allow enough time for questions.
Yeah, I wonder
Yes.
whether we have to be led by you. I wonder whether we get stuff from you.
Absolutely no problem. We can come back to that if we want to. Okay.
10 minutes on
Absolutely, sure. So all of this builds together into, thank you so much. All of this builds together into how Lewis is able to speak into the culture around him. In the same way as he started with things that matter to him, he started from concerns that people had. He started from the things that worried them, the moral state of the world, the things that they were longing for as they were growing more and more wealthy but found themselves missing things. He wrestled with their understandings of comfort and its relationship to truth. He said, if you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth, only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin, and in the end, despair. Put truth first, in other words. Lewis, in his prophetic voice to culture, was utterly committed to speaking the truth and retaining a sense of describing and communicating the truth to people around him. Now, for him, this didn't make him arrogant, as we sometimes fear people who speak the truth in our world might be. In fact, Lewis, in his encounter with the truth about God, had been so humbled himself that he could only approach other people in sympathy. I was talking to somebody just before I started speaking, and we were reflecting how Lewis came alongside people as a friend almost. As you read him, he shows you his reasoning, he shows you where he's going, and shepherds you along in the journey of thinking through your beliefs. Lewis was able then to speak truth into society from a confidence about what God had revealed and done in Christ. Okay, I think I'm okay. I'll just stay quite still. He spoke truth into society from a confidence of what he had become convinced about God having done in Christ. And he was willing to ask people to make a decision and felt that there was some urgency in the need to do so. In the model of the Apostle Paul, where the Apostle Paul in Acts 17 began to see himself as the apostle sent to the Gentiles, as he started to reach out to the Greek and Athenian philosophers, in the same sort of way, Lewis, not seeing himself as an apostle at all, but seeing himself as a translator, wanted to translate the gospel into the language, into the types of arguments that would appeal to the modern world. And he was able to do this in a very unique way, and this is why his voice was so powerful, because his own journey had involved reason and imagination, and he'd found through his conversation with Tolkien a way to bring those two things together. He was able then to articulate a vision of Christian faith and a vision of the gospel that appealed to people from literary backgrounds, from artistic backgrounds, from philosophical backgrounds, from all sorts of walks of life. Through his writing and his speaking, he sought to appeal to the imagination and to reason. I see something very powerful happening in Lewis in this. Sometimes we think that in order to make an impact in our day, in our age, we have to be given some supernatural power or gifting or insight or ability, some sort of extraordinary gifting. And yes, Lewis was somebody who was extraordinarily gifted. He had a first-rate mind. But actually, the persevering ideas of Lewis that stay with us were actually the simple working through and explaining of his faith, using his mind, using his ability to write. Sometimes we might feel we can't have an impact in our space, in our day. But I think Lewis is an example of somebody who was naturally supernatural. Yes, I think the hand of God touched Lewis, and he was a prophetic voice in his moment of history. He spoke to a nation, he spoke to a world, and still speaks through his combination and diversity of communications and arguments and approaches. And we haven't even begun to scrape the surface of his fictional works. And yet, as God touched that man, I think he worked within his gifting as a scholar, within his gifting as a bumbling human being with threadbare jackets, who was lovable, who was flawed in other ways. And God used examples of things in his life, like his natural capacity for great friendship, to win many into a hearing about the gospel. So here's my challenge to each of us, and to you perhaps. What gifts do you have? What skills do you have that you could offer, like the little boy who offered his loaves and his fish, that you could offer into God's service, that God might use you to speak to the people around you as an example of his life and his love in a world that so badly needs the message of the gospel? Okay, I will stop there, and I would love to invite your questions. Sure.
Thank you very much for that rich offering to us. We've got about 20-25 minutes, so if you keep your questions to the point, then we'll get through a good number of them. I know that you've all got great big voices and that you won't be of any difficulty being heard here, but for the sake of those listening at home, or those who might listen at some point in the future, it would be wonderful if you would deign to speak your questions into the microphone, and then we'll have a record for all time. Would anyone like to kick off? Mr. Hugh Berger.
I was wondering if Jonathan will forgive me, if you could say something about C.S. Lewis's book, which I believe was called The Problem of Pain and Suffering, just very quickly.
Absolutely.
Time permits.
So thank you so
And
much.
so I was hoping to avoid any suffering. Take up your cross, though, and,
Okay.
and follow.
So Lewis's response to suffering has two parts. And I think this was planned, that's my view. His book, A Grief Observed, is the partner to the problem of pain. The problem of pain is him wrestling with more of the philosophical, more of the intellectual problem of pain. How can God be just if there's pain and evil and suffering in the world? How can God be good? Can he be omnipotent or powerful? How do we understand God's goodness in the light of a world that is so pained? And his answer is, broadly speaking, a version of what's called the free will defense, where human beings are so valued by God that they're given the capacity to be free in order to have the possibility of having free relationship with God. Now, Lewis says a lot more. He admits that there is much that we don't know. There are questions that he says he will not answer, like, why did God believe it was worth making the world, seeing that it would fall and that there would be suffering? He says, I don't feel I can answer that question, but I do know that the answer it was because I know God is good. So part of the way Lewis tackled the problem of pain, and also part of what happened in his own story too, was that he recognized and saw, I mean, he must have seen this very early on, given his experiences in warfare, but he saw that there were two sides to the problem. There is that thinking problem, and that's what the problem of pain is about. And it's a good book and a thoughtful book on the thinking problem. But if you go reading that book and your primary question is, how can I find a way to let God into my tears? I'm stuck in my grief. How can I find a way to let God into this, to connect with God, to find God in my grief? You probably won't find the answer in The Problem of Pain or in any philosophical books that discuss the problem of suffering, as helpful as those philosophical books might well be. In fact, I would say that this is where Lewis's book, A Grief Observed, comes in, and it talks about what's called the personal, the pastoral, the emotional problem of suffering and pain. And this is the problem of, okay, well, I may see that it philosophically makes sense, but to be honest, I'm not even sure if I want to know God relationally, because it hurts and because I just feel wronged, or I'm stuck in my feelings. I'm just utterly hopeless. And Lewis presents in this both a story of shared suffering, because he recounts the story of watching his wife die of cancer. That is the grief that is observed. But he also describes how in Christ, we not only have an answer to what's wrong with the world and God's decision to do something about the world and to rescue the world, but we also have somebody who goes into suffering on the cross. My dad had a heart attack when he was 55. He's okay now. He's had a big bypass operation, but he had a fairly serious heart attack. And he didn't really know anybody else who'd had the same experience. And he went from riding his bike up a hill suddenly to a week and a half later being in hospital, facing this quite serious operation with a worrying percentage on the bottom of the form that he had to sign. And a friend of his rang him up just beforehand and said, "Hey, I heard what happened. I wanted you to know that I've also had this operation. I had the same thing not so long ago. You're probably feeling a bit like this. You're probably feeling like this and this." And they talked for a while. And I think it really helped him to know that what he was feeling was okay and to know that he was understood and seen in what he felt. When you suffer, one of the things that you experience, one of the things that I experience, is a sense of disconnection, a sense of aloneness, an isolation from other people, both physically, emotionally, personally, psychologically. Lewis argues in A Grief Observed on the other side of the problem of pain that because of what Christ went through, he can come into our isolation, he can come into it, and we don't even need to tell him what it feels like to be so alone that we've forgotten whether anybody really knows us, because he knows us, because he knows what it is to feel so cut off and so isolated because of what he went through. I think you've got to hold the two together. I love A Grief Observed. I think it goes with the problem of pain. And Lewis's key insight on suffering was we need different tools for different questions that we ask.
What was the inspiration for the screw tape letters?
Yeah. I don't know exactly what the inspiration for the screw tape letters was in terms of Lewis's life. I'd be interested to know if there was something concrete. There often is in any artistic work of fiction. There often is something you see or something that sparks it off. I would say theologically that there's a very, very clear impulse or inspiration in the theological explanation that comes from Scripture, where we're told that there is a spiritual battle going on, and there is a real devil who seeks to distract us from the important and crucial questions of life, tying us up with busyness, tying us up with other things. And I think Lewis sort of riffed off that and built the screw tape letters out of that idea, that there is, that we are now in a global cosmic conflict. I don't want to sound like I'm some sort of conspiracy theorist, but the Bible presents the picture that there is an ongoing cosmic conflict, and that part of the reason why we see suffering in the world is because that battlefield is playing out in reality. And God is in that battle and has already won in what he's done on the cross. But so we're not hopeless in that battle. But the picture of Scripture is of a interconnected cosmic battle. And I think that's probably some of where Lewis is, wondering. I think he's also wanting to observe culture and see how people talk about the devil as a little sort of harmless thing, and he's wanting to actually throw that idea around a bit and get us thinking about that, and think about what distracts us. I like the line that is taken where it's both a spiritual reading of events is offered, but it's also not determinative. It's also not the only possibility. And so I think probably some of those theological impulses are behind some of Lewis's work on Screwtape. Not to mention there's probably literary sources as well. I'm sure somebody could speak to that, but I don't know what exactly they are.
How do you think Lewis's unconventional
for example, marrying one of his comrades' mothers, and also living with his alcoholic brother, affected the theology he went on to write?
Yes, I think that's a good question. How did Lewis's unconventional home situation affect him and the way he approached things? Do you know what? I think that probably was some of the genesis and some of the causal material that led to distinctions like mere Christianity. Because I think he probably experienced, I know that he experienced a certain amount of social reaction and judgment from people around him. Tolkien was not happy with some of his relational arrangements. It's probably true then that Lewis wanted then to strive to make the center question of Christianity even more central, and not to get bogged down in secondary and tertiary issues and questions. Was it okay for Christians to have tattoos and to smoke and to... I think he probably became a bit more accepting of people from unconventional points of view. Now, of course, being an Oxford man, he would have had to rub shoulders with people from all kinds of different viewpoints and perspectives, and so he will have been well-rounded and well-acquainted. And certainly the Inklings were a group of, a menagerie, really, of different characters and different people from different backgrounds and different influences, and some of them were all over the place theologically. But I think Lewis's unconventional home life meant that he was free in many ways for much of his early life to read and to write and to develop his work. He had a very energetic letter writing promise. He wrote a letter, I think, to everybody who wrote to him. Thousands and thousands of letters were generated by him. The other link for Lewis with his unconventional home life was, I think had he gone and lived in a, perhaps, for Lewis, had he gone and lived in the city centre, I don't think he would have had such fertile material for the writing of his fiction. Let me try to explain a little bit of what I mean by this. If you go to the Kilns, the house that we're talking about, the unconventional sort of living arrangement, or the unconventional house, and we're not mentioning the marriage stuff specifically in this, but his sort of different lifestyle, let's say. There was a pond which he would swim in the back garden. There were all sorts of influences around the city which would speak into and would be part of the imaginative works that he would create. We know that for Tolkien this was very important. The mill where he went to near Birmingham was a very important influence for the Shire, Sareholm Mill, I think it is. So I think there were some influences there in that side of his sort of unconventional life. The characters that Lewis might create, probably he imagined wandering around the kilns and wandering around in the woodlands behind. And it was certainly true that Lewis would, for a long time than people thought was healthy, would go on long walks by himself and have all sorts of imaginary conversations with talking animals that he'd created in his own mental space. So yeah, I think probably made him a bit less judgmental. It probably focused him a bit more on mere Christianity and the core gospel. It probably had a sort of sense of rich imaginative influences on him for his fiction. So probably those would be some of the ways that I think his unconventional life might have affected him. I'd love to try swapping, sure.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the impact of the Inklings on some of his work as well.
Inklings on Lewis's work. Well, the Inklings would gather for a time in the Eagle and Child, and then when it went through some refurbishment, they moved over. And much to the disdain of any Americans that visit Oxford, who think that it all happened in the Eagle and Child, they actually moved over the road to the pub over the road, which they, I think, preferred the food in, and the Lamb and Flag, I believe. And they would meet and they would read literature to each other. They would read stories to each other, and they would work on each other's. They would read over each other's shoulders, if you like. Tolkien would read the stories that he'd been writing about Middle Earth to them, and they would give him feedback, and they would laugh about the characters, and they would talk about them a huge amount. The Inklings were important for Lewis in several ways, because they stimulated him to keep writing. They stimulated him to think about how he was going to put things. I think in some ways they were, at times, a barrier as well, because the Inklings seem to be more geared towards adult writing for adults, and whereas Lewis's Narnia chronicles, I think, are more written for children. And so, from what I've gathered, the reception of the Narnia stories to the Inklings group wasn't as warm as some of the other stories was. Tolkien, for example, apparently thought that they were a little bit childish. And I think that's fair, because they were written and are written for children, even though an adult can reread them and find much very interesting stuff in there. A further thought, the first woman to gain a lecture post at Oxford University, I believe, was Evelyn Underhill. And she was, I don't know whether she was actually officially one of the Inklings, but she certainly was in the circle of friends who were on the periphery of the Inklings. She once said to Lewis, this idea of God in your stories, it's so soft, it's so sort of, he's like this nice character who comes in and sorts out everybody's problems. Why don't you make God a bit fiercer? Now, around this same point, Aslan was created. And it's said of Aslan that he's good, but not safe. And I wonder whether there's a connection there between perhaps a conversation with a contemporary of the Inklings and an idea that directly went into Lewis's fictional writing. Certainly, Lewis's science fiction trilogy, which I think that Lewis's science fiction trilogy, particularly the third book, it's called That Hideous Strength. It's very few people have read it, but it's absolutely fascinating. It was written in 1936, and it was written as a result of a dare with Tolkien. Tolkien and Lewis were talking, as members of the Inklings, they were talking about how it was a shame that all of H.G. Wells' science fiction had man going off and exploring the universe and cosmos in spaceships, and it was a godless universe. Man went in his spaceship and never found God. He might have found aliens and other things, but never found God. Why was all this science fiction atheistic, in other words, or agnostic about God? And so Lewis and Tolkien dared each other to create some science fiction that was theistic. Tolkien did have a go. He didn't write as much science fiction. I think his book was called, or his story was called The Two Towers, if you want to find it. But Lewis went really for it. And he wrote, I mean, some of the, a literature scholar will tell you, some of the flow of the ideas and the writing, it could hang together a bit tighter. I mean, it's sort of, Lewis is finding his voice as a fiction writer, perhaps we might say generously. But in the third book of the science fiction trilogy, written in 1936, this is what Lewis says. He says, there will come a time when an institute will be affiliated, or there will be a sort of scientific institute that will be affiliated to universities. This particular institute was called the NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. And in the fictional story of That Hideous Strength, this particular story, this institute is linked to Cambridge. Now, in this institute, what is happening? Well, criminals have got this sort of, they've got this very grotesque head, physical head of a criminal that they're keeping alive by various different experiments and various different chemicals they're pumping into it and artificially breathing for it and etc. It's quite horrible. But they are working on a plan to help mankind to survive his own death by using technology. So in other words, they're trying to transpose human selves into robot bodies or into computer systems in order to allow us to survive our own deaths. So in the last 10 years, there's been the emergence of a viewpoint called transhumanism. Some of us call it atheism with hope. It's like humanism 2.0 or atheism 2.0. And the idea is that mankind will rescue ourselves from aging, from death, from sickness, from disease, and we will overcome biological limitations using technology. I think when Lewis wrote That Hideous Strength, he foresaw it. I think it is his most prophetic moment. And I think we're going to see in the next 300 or 400 years, I think we're going to see Lewis's prediction about how man will use technology to become one of the dominant ideas of the next 300 years. That was influenced, and that came out of a conversation with Tolkien. I dare you to write some science fiction. Members of the Inklings, sparking each other off. Wonderful.
I wonder if I can ask you one last question, which is about today. You were saying that Lewis was popular. He was being broadcast on the BBC. That he was writing literature that was in the hands of tens of hundreds of thousands of children and adults. Do you see today a populist, theistic voice in the public square? Who is that, or is that something we're lacking?
Well, I think we do need another Lewis. I think we need a lot more Lewises. I mean, I would point to some modern day examples of Lewis. I think there are a few of them. I'll point to a couple. Tim Keller in New York, Nicky Gumbel at HTB. I would point to J. John, Michael Ramsden. I would point to people like Amy Orr Ewing, N.T. Wright, among others. And I think we are seeing the emergence of believers who are able to interact with the thinking and the questions of our age. I think that we need to pray. If we're believers, I think we need to pray for God to raise up and God to draw and release people like Lewis, men and women who can speak for God in their moment, in their day, to the questions of our age. The questions of our age are different. We have questions about borders and nationalism and reconciliation. How can such different groups in our world be reconciled and live in peace together? We need people who can speak, as Lewis spoke for the issues of his day, we need people who can speak to the questions of our day. And I think that there are signs that these individuals are emerging. But I don't think there's just one. I think there are a number of them. There are a number of different, I'm encouraged by this. There are a number of different theological institutions, there are a number of different colleges who are taking philosophy seriously, who are engaging with philosophy seriously and are engaging with culture and the arts seriously. I think it's brilliant to train ordinands, to train curates, to train vicars, to train the laity, to train as many people as possible, but they must be trained to be able to engage with the political and with the philosophical ideas of the day. We must be trained in bioethics. We must be trained to be able to answer questions around how we will use biotechnology in the future. It's very, very important that the church sees the moment that Lewis stood in, and Lewis was equipped and prepared for that through secular scholarship. We need to, in many ways, I think the church, in its retreat from seminaries, what happened in the last 100 years is that the church was concerned globally that university-based theological training had become compromised in liberalism. And so the church set up its own separate theological institutions, its separate seminaries and training groups. And in doing that, it, yes, taught great theology, rich theology, and people got equipped and prepared to think. but they also were separated from the skeptical and difficult questions that were being asked at universities. And so many, as Francis Schaeffer said, many people who were preaching and speaking, many who might have had the opportunity of Lewis, were aware of the answers, but they didn't know what the questions were. And so I think, I'm a big believer, and I spend part of my time advocating and encouraging the growth of apologetics, which is the sort of area of giving an answer for the hope that you have, giving a reason for the hope that you have. I think we need to both teach great theology. We also need to equip people with some basic skills of philosophy. We also need to train and equip people in handling the arts and handling and understanding what's happening when we're involved in the world of business and the world of work, and how that connects to the gospel. But I also think that there's a real need for people who are trained in apologetics. That's why I've given the last 15 years to training students in apologetics. We've had a few hundred now who have come through and have been sponsored by donors from all over the world to do courses in academic theology, fully exposed to all of the different thought forms that you find in a modern university, but also equipped and able to speak. And so I think we need to pray. I think we need to encourage. I think where we have resources, we need to release them. And I think we need to, where there's opportunity, we can point to people like Tim Keller. We can point to people like J. John and N.T. Wright and others, and we can introduce people to those voices that might help them think through their questions too. Thank you.
Thank you for informing us this evening, for challenging us, for, I suspect, inspiring a few of us to go back and read some more Lewis or some of those other voices, contemporary voices that you just...
Can I say one thing at that point?
Yeah, go on.
If you struggled with Lewis, maybe you picked up Mere Christianity, you found the first couple of chapters a bit hard going. Anybody in that camp? Okay, maybe you wouldn't admit it. Okay, so
it's Kensington, you know.
Turn to the back of the book. Turn to the back of the book. The chapters on joy and love, they are some of the best chapters he ever wrote in his life.
Super. You heard it here first, or maybe you already knew it. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. You can't fawn over Tom for too long because he's got to get back to Oxford and to his family, but I'm sure he'll take a few parting salvos as he's going out. But please show your appreciation to him. For those of you who are here from the confirmation group, a reminder that we're 7 o'clock back up at the church centre next week. Back up at the church centre next week, 7 o'clock.
charismatic letters.
Hello, Alison. Lovely you were able to come.
Wasn't that lovely?
Oh, terrific. I love it, don't you?
Yes.
I love it. Yeah.
I'm going to catch the streaming afterwards and go through it again.
Yeah.